The origins of the Jewish presence in the territories that would one day comprise the Austrian state are found within the administrative and military structures of the Roman Empire during the 1st century. As the legions of Tiberius and Claudius expanded the imperial frontier to the banks of the Danube, they established a chain of castra and civil settlements, collectively known as the limes. Among the soldiers, administrators, and merchants who followed these military advancements were the first Jewish travelers, predominantly arriving from the eastern Mediterranean and the Italian peninsula. Archaeological evidence recovered from the Roman sites of Carnuntum and Vindobona provides tangible links to this early period. A notable discovery includes a 3rd century lead amulet found in a child's grave at Carnuntum, inscribed with the Shema Yisrael in Greek letters, which confirms the persistence of Jewish liturgical practice even in the remote northern provinces. Additional findings of oil lamps decorated with menorah motifs in the ruins of Roman villas along the Danube further substantiate the integration of Jewish households within the local provincial economy. During this era, the legal status of Jewish residents was governed by the Constitutio Antoniniana of 212, which granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire, thereby incorporating Jewish individuals into the civic and legal framework of the Roman state. These early settlers operated primarily as traders and suppliers for the Roman military, providing essential goods that were not locally produced. They utilized the sophisticated Roman road network that crossed the Alpine passes to link the Danubian frontier with the commercial centers of Aquileia and Rome. The first organized communities likely centered around the major river ports, where the exchange of grain, salt, and luxury items from the Orient occurred. These merchants were exempt from certain pagan religious obligations due to their status as a religio licita, a recognized and protected religion under Roman law, which allowed for the maintenance of monotheistic traditions without immediate persecution from the state. Historical records from the 4th century, specifically the Edicts of the Council of Elvira, and later the Theodosian Code, reflect the growing necessity for the Roman administration to define the boundaries between the burgeoning Christian Church and the established Jewish communities. While these legal documents often sought to restrict social interactions, they also confirm that the Jewish population was a permanent and legally recognized fixture of the socio-economic landscape in provinces like Noricum and Pannonia. The disintegration of Roman military control in the 5th century led to a temporary decline in urban records. Yet archaeological continuities suggest that small pockets of the population remained near the ruins of the castra, preserving their identity through the tumultuous transition into the early Middle Ages. Just a quick announcement. If you enjoy this video, please subscribe to our channel as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. This initial phase established the demographic precedent for Jewish life in the region, marking the transition from transient Roman subjects to settled inhabitants of the Danubian basin centuries before the rise of the Austrian duchy. The 12th century signaled a transformative era for the Jewish population within the East Mark, as the transition from transient merchant activity to permanent urban settlement accelerated under the Babenberg dynasty. Following the relocation of the ducal residence to Vienna in 1145 by Henry II Jasomirgott, the city underwent rapid expansion, necessitating the expertise of specialized financiers and international traders. Jewish settlers, largely migrating from the Rhineland and the Danubian regions of Bavaria, established a concentrated quarter in the vicinity of the modern-day Judenplatz. This area served as the administrative and spiritual epicenter of the community, characterized by the construction of a permanent stone synagogue and the establishment of a centralized cemetery. Unlike the scattered rural populations of the early Middle Ages, these urban residents were formally integrated into the ducal fiscal system categorized as servi cameri, or serfs of the chamber. This legal designation, while implying a subordinate status, provided a high degree of protection as the duke claimed exclusive jurisdiction over their persons and property, exempting them from the often hostile local municipal courts. But why did it all end with the expulsion of all Jews, and did they actually deserve it? The economic infrastructure of medieval Austria relied heavily on the capital liquidity provided by the Jewish community, which filled the vacuum left by canonical prohibitions against usury for Christians. Documents from this period, such as the Raffelstetten customs regulations, record the active participation of Jewish merchants in the trade of salt, cattle, and slaves, although by the late 1100s their focus shifted increasingly toward large-scale credit operations. In Wiener Neustadt, founded in 1194 with the ransom money of Richard the Lionheart, the Jewish community was granted specific privileges to facilitate the city's defense and development. The intellectual landscape flourished alongside this economic growth, as Vienna became a renowned center of rabbinic learning. Prominent scholars such as Rabbi Isaac ben Moses, the author of the influential Or Zarua, established a yeshiva that attracted students from across the Holy Roman Empire. The teachings of the sages of Vienna provided the halakhic framework for Central European Jewish life, emphasizing the reconciliation of traditional religious law with the practicalities of a minority existence within a feudal Christian state. The social structure of the Vienna community was defined by a self-governing council known as the Kahal, which managed internal affairs, including the distribution of the communal tax burden and the oversight of charitable institutions like the Hekdesh. By the end of the 12th century, the Jewish quarter featured specialized infrastructure, including ritual baths, or mikvaot, and communal slaughterhouses, reflecting a high degree of internal organization. This period of flourishing was further solidified by the 1192 privilege granted by Duke Leopold V, which reaffirmed the security of the community in response to the growing fervor of the crusading movement. While the broader European continent experienced waves of pogroms, the Babenberg administration maintained a strictly pragmatic policy, recognizing the Jewish population as an indispensable demographic for the duchy's fiscal health and territorial consolidation. This institutional stability allowed for the emergence of a sophisticated urban culture that bridged the gap between the Germanic frontier and the wider Mediterranean and Oriental trade networks, setting the stage for the definitive legal charters of the 13th century. The promulgation of the Statuta Judiorum in 1244 by Duke Frederick II, the last of the Babenberg rulers, represents the definitive legal foundation for Jewish life in Austria, transcending previous informal protections. This landmark charter consisted of 31 distinct articles designed to regulate the judicial, economic, and social interactions between the Jewish population and the Christian majority. A primary innovation of the document was the establishment of a specialized judicial officer known as the Judenrichter, or Judge of the Jews. This official, typically a Christian noble appointed by the Duke, held exclusive jurisdiction over cases involving both Jewish and Christian parties, ensuring that disputes were settled according to the specific provisions of the charter rather than local municipal law. The Statuta specifically protected Jewish life and property, imposing severe financial and physical penalties for the desecration of cemeteries or the physical assault of community members. Crucially, the document also prohibited the practice of forced conversion, explicitly protecting the religious autonomy of Jewish households and ensuring that communal life could proceed without the immediate threat of state-sponsored proselytization. Economically, the 1244 Charter codified the Jewish community's role as the primary provider of credit within the duchy, establishing clear regulations for interest rates and the handling of collateral. One of the most significant articles addressed the right of mortgage, which allowed Jewish creditors to accept land and property as security for loans, a provision that facilitated the flow of capital into the Austrian agricultural and aristocratic sectors. The charter also provided for the safety of Jewish travelers, granting them the same protections as ducal merchants and exempting them from arbitrary tolls and seizures on the imperial highways. This legal security encouraged the expansion of trade networks from the Danube Valley into the Styrian and Carinthian territories, which Frederick II had recently consolidated under his rule. The document further clarified the rules of evidence, stipulating that in cases involving a Jewish defendant and a Christian plaintiff, the testimony of a Jewish witness was required to secure a conviction, a measure intended to prevent the systemic abuse of the judicial process by predatory litigants. The political significance of the privilegium was deeply tied to Frederick II's ongoing conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor and his need to secure a reliable source of revenue, independent of the traditional feudal tithes. By categorizing the Jewish community as direct subjects of the ducal treasury, the Statuta bypassed the ecclesiastical authorities, who frequently sought to impose restrictive Fourth Lateran Council decrees within the duchy. This administrative independence allowed the Austrian Jewish community to avoid the mandatory wearing of identifying badges or hats during the mid-13th century, a restriction that was common in other parts of Western Europe. The demographic stability provided by the charter led to a surge in Jewish immigration from the more volatile regions of the Rhineland, turning Austria into a sanctuary of relative legal predictability. Even after the extinction of the Babenberg line in 1246, the 1244 Statuta remained the governing legal framework, as it was formally reconfirmed by King Ottokar II of Bohemia and later by the first Habsburg rulers. This continuity ensured that the institutional structures of the Kahal remained intact, providing a buffer against the rising social tensions that would characterize the later medieval period. The 13th century marked the zenith of Jewish intellectual life in Vienna, as the city transformed into a primary hub for halakhic discourse, under a group of scholars, collectively known as the Sages of Vienna. Central to this academic flourishing was Rabbi Isaac ben Moses, whose monumental work, the Or Zarua, served as both a comprehensive legal code and a detailed record of the customs of the Ashkenazi communities in France, Germany, and the Danubian territories. The Or Zarua, meaning sown light, introduced a rigorous method of source analysis, synthesizing the decisions of the Rhenish Tosafists with the specific administrative requirements of the Austrian duchy. This text provided the definitive guidelines for communal governance, addressing everything from the laws of the Sabbath to the complex regulations of monetary exchange and property rights. The influence of this scholarship was not localized. The legal opinions formulated in the Vienna yeshivas were frequently cited in the responsa of contemporary scholars in Bohemia and Italy, establishing a unified liturgical and judicial standard for Central European Jewry. The instructional environment of the 13th century Vienna yeshivas was characterized by a transition from oral transmission to the systematic codification of ritual law. Rabbi Isaac's student and successor, Rabbi Meir ben Baruch of Rothenburg, further refined the Vienna style of scholarship, which emphasized the practical application of Talmudic principles to the daily challenges of a minority population living under the protection of secular princes. The curriculum of these schools extended beyond the study of the Bavli to include advanced investigations into Hebrew grammar and mathematical calculations necessary for the determination of the lunar calendar. The physical infrastructure of these schools was concentrated within the Judenstadt, where specialized libraries housed handwritten parchment scrolls and codices. The scribal arts flourished during this period, as evidenced by the high quality of Austrian Hebrew manuscripts, which utilized a distinctive Gothic-influenced script and featured complex marginalia that reflected ongoing debates between the Vienna school and the rabbinic authorities of the Rhineland. The theological innovations of the Or Zarua period also addressed the social dynamics of the medieval urban market, particularly the concept of Dina di Malkuta Dina, or the law of the kingdom is law. The Vienna sages provided a robust legal justification for the Jewish community's compliance with the Duke's fiscal and judicial systems, effectively bridging the gap between sacred law and the administrative realities of the Babenberg and early Habsburg reigns. This intellectual framework enabled the community to maintain internal religious integrity while participating in the broader municipal economy. Furthermore, the 13th century saw the development of a unique ascetic and mystical movement in Vienna, influenced by the Hasidei Ashkenaz, which emphasized spiritual devotion and ethical conduct as a response to the external pressures of the era. The presence of these scholars turned Vienna into a destination for pilgrims and students from across Europe, ensuring that the city remained a center of Jewish gravity, even as the political fortunes of the Holy Roman Empire fluctuated. By the late 1200s, the intellectual dominance of the Vienna community was codified through the establishment of the rabbinate as a permanent communal office. This institutionalization ensured that judicial decisions regarding inheritance, marriage, and trade remained under the authority of experts trained in the Orzarua tradition. The scholarship of this golden age provided the ideological resilience that would sustain the community through the following century of economic shifts and the demographic shocks of the mid-14th century. The legacy of the 13th century Vienna school survived the eventual physical destruction of the community, as their manuscripts were carried by refugees to Poland and the Ottoman Empire, where they continued to serve as foundational texts for Ashkenazi halachic development for centuries. The 14th century represented a phase of profound economic interdependence, where the Jewish community functioned as the primary engine for the Austrian duchy's financial liquidity and logistical reach. This period of symbiosis was rooted in the community's control over specialized trade routes that linked the Danubian markets to the trans-Eurasian networks of the Silk Road and the maritime hubs of the Mediterranean. Jewish merchants in Vienna and Graz facilitated the import of high-value commodities, including Levantine spices, damask silks, and oriental dyes, which were essential for the display of status among the burgeoning Habsburg court. The export trade was equally robust, involving the transport of Austrian silver and lead from the Styrian mines to the commercial centers of Venice and the Levant. This transcontinental commerce was supported by a sophisticated system of letters of credit and bill brokerage, which allowed for the secure movement of value across vast distances without the physical transport of bullion, a technological advantage that the local Christian merchant guilds had yet to master. The capital generated through these mercantile activities provided the House of Habsburg with the necessary resources for extensive military and architectural endeavors. Specifically, the reign of Duke Rudolf IV, known as the Founder, saw the aggressive expansion of the Stephansdom and the establishment of the University of Vienna, projects that were significantly financed through the taxation and credit facilities provided by Jewish bankers. The ducal treasury utilized these funds to consolidate territorial claims in Tyrol and Carniola, transforming Austria from a regional frontier into a centralized European power. Furthermore, Jewish residents served as essential administrative intermediaries, managing the mints and the collection of customs duties at the border crossings of the Enns and the Mur. This role as factors to the crown granted the community a degree of social integration that surpassed mere economic utility, as Jewish expertise in metallurgy and arithmetic was applied to the standardization of the Austrian pound and the refinement of local coinage. The social integration of this period was characterized by a complex, neighborly coexistence within the urban fabric of the growing cities. In Vienna, the expansion of the Jewish quarter mirrored the city's overall growth, with communal infrastructure, such as the municipal hospital and the public slaughterhouse, becoming landmarks of the district's permanence. Legal records from the mid-1300s indicate that Jewish property owners frequently engaged in real estate transactions with Christian neighbors, governed by a dual notary system that recognized the validity of Hebrew signatures in secular courts. This era also witnessed the rise of the Hofjuden or court Jews, elite individuals who acted as personal advisors to the dukes, bridging the gap between the insular communal life of the Judenstaat and the high-stakes diplomacy of the imperial court. This integration was not merely a matter of convenience, but a structural necessity for the state, as the Jewish community provided the only reliable source of ready capital in an era where the feudal economy remained largely grounded in agrarian production and land-based wealth. By the late 14th century, this economic symbiosis had reached its maximum threshold, creating a socio-political environment where the fortunes of the Habsburg state were inextricably linked to the prosperity of its Jewish subjects. The community's ability to mobilize large sums for the Duke's defensive wars against the burgeoning Ottoman threat or internal dynastic rivalries ensured their continued protection against the recurring pressures from the local clergy. This period of integration provided the stability required for the community to maintain its own unique educational and charitable institutions, which operated in parallel to the developing Christian municipal guilds. The infrastructure of the 14th century Austrian economy, defined by this balance of credit, commerce, and administrative service, would remain the standard until the unprecedented demographic and theological disruptions of the early 15th century began to erode the foundations of this high medieval order. The arrival of the Yersinia pestis in the Austrian territories during the summer of 1348 initiated a profound structural crisis that fundamentally disrupted the social and legal stasis of the high medieval period. As the pandemic decimated approximately one-third of the urban population in Vienna and the surrounding Danube provinces, the collapse of administrative order facilitated the emergence of irrational conspiratorial narratives. In contrast to the well-poisoning accusations that had originated in the Savoyard and Rhenish regions, the Austrian outbreaks were initially met with a state-directed effort to maintain judicial equilibrium. Duke Albrecht II, known as the Wise, issued a series of mandates intended to protect the Jewish communities from mob violence, recognizing that the destruction of the community would result in the permanent loss of crown assets and the collapse of the duchy's credit infrastructure. The ducal administration attempted to enforce the 1244 charter by stationing armed guards at the gates of the Judenstadt, asserting that any assault on Jewish residents constituted a direct violation of the sovereign's peace. Despite these preventative measures, the socio-economic pressure generated by the mortality rates proved stronger than the centralized ducal authority. By 1349, waves of popular violence erupted in various regional centers, notably in Krems and Tulln, where the local municipal councils often stood by or actively participated in the liquidation of Jewish households. These persecutions were frequently motivated by the desire to destroy debt records and ledgers held by Jewish financiers, effectively utilizing the chaos of the plague as a mechanism for involuntary debt relief. In Vienna, while the Duke managed to prevent a total massacre of the scale seen in Strasbourg or Mainz, the community was forced to provide massive special contributions to the treasury, to fund the state's defensive posture, and to compensate for the plummeting tax revenues. This financial extraction signaled a shift from the high medieval symbiotic relationship toward a more predatory fiscal policy, where the community's safety was explicitly tied to increasingly exorbitant payments. The demographic impact of this period was characterized by a temporary contraction followed by a strategic consolidation. Unlike the absolute expulsion seen in Western Europe, the Austrian Habsburgs permitted the survivors of the 1,349 persecutions to remain, provided they absorbed the abandoned properties and continued to facilitate the regional capital markets. However, the internal landscape of the Jewish quarter was irrevocably altered. The loss of leading scholars and communal administrators during the plague years resulted in a temporary decline in the intellectual output of the Vienna yeshivas. Furthermore, the ecclesiastical authorities in Austria began to exert greater pressure on the ducal court, successfully advocating for more restrictive residency laws and the limitation of Jewish land ownership in the rural hinterlands. This legislative creep marked the first significant erosion of the privilegium of the previous century, introducing a precedent for judicial discrimination that would be exploited by later administrations. By the time the initial pandemic subsided in 1350, the Jewish community had effectively transitioned from a secure pillar of the duchy to a vulnerable demographic whose existence was increasingly dependent on the personal whim and financial needs of the sovereign. The structural cracks in the social fabric were now permanent, as the Christian guilds and municipal leaders viewed the Jewish survivors with a combination of economic resentment and theological suspicion that the state could no longer fully suppress. This environment of precarious stability was managed through a series of pacta, or temporary agreements, that required the community to renegotiate their residency rights every few years, a departure from the for all eternity language of the 1244 statutes. This era of post-plague recovery thus established the volatile psychological and legal climate that the ambitious Duke Albert V would inherit in the early 15th century, setting the stage for the final dismantling of the medieval Austrian Jewish order. The accession of Duke Albert V in 1411 marked a definitive departure from the pragmatic Habsburg governance that had characterized the preceding century. Following the dissolution of the Regency Council that had managed the Albertine territories since the death of Albert IV in 1404, The young duke assumed direct control over a realm strained by dynastic fragmentation and the burgeoning threat of religious reform movements in neighboring Bohemia. Unlike his predecessors, who viewed the Jewish population primarily through the lens of fiscal utility and administrative stability, Albert V was deeply influenced by the burgeoning academic and clerical circles of the University of Vienna. This institution, which had grown into a premier center of scholastic theology in Central Europe, became the primary laboratory for a new, exclusionary political ideology. The Faculty of Theology, led by influential figures such as Thomas Ebbendorfer of Hazelbach, began to articulate a vision of the state where religious homogeneity was the prerequisite for political legitimacy and divine favor. This period witnessed a fundamental shift in the advisory structure of the ducal court. The traditional Hofjuden and secular financiers who had previously navigated the halls of power found their access curtailed as the duke increasingly relied on a concilium dominated by churchmen and university masters. These advisors promoted the doctrine that the persistence of Jewish communities within a Christian duchy was not merely a legal anomaly but a theological affront that undermined the spiritual health of the population. This rhetoric was systematically disseminated through the university's pulpits and academic disputations, moving from the realm of abstract theology into the gears of state administration. The legal framework of the 15th century Austrian state began to reflect this hardening stance, as the Duke sanctioned new restrictive ordinances that prohibited Jewish residents from employing Christian domestic servants and further limited their ability to own property in proximity to Christian sacred sites. Furthermore, Albert V's political ambitions were inextricably tied to his relationship with his father-in-law, the German king, and later Emperor Sigismund. As the designated heir to the Bohemian and Hungarian crowns, Albert sought to position himself as the premier defender of Catholic orthodoxy against the rising tide of the Hussite heresy. His theological advisors argued that the internal threat posed by the Jewish presence was linked to the external threat of the Bohemian reformers, creating a narrative of dual subversion. This ideological alignment allowed the Duke to consolidate his authority among the local nobility and urban guilds, who harbored long-standing economic grievances against Jewish competitors. By framing the Jewish community as an alien element whose fiscal contributions were no longer sufficient to justify their legal protections, the ducal administration effectively began the process of delegitimizing the centuries-old charters of the House of Babenberg. The administrative shift was also evidenced by the Duke's direct involvement in the appointment of municipal leaders who shared his theological convictions. By 1415, the governance of Vienna and Wiener Neustadt had transitioned into the hands of officials who favored the strict enforcement of earlier, dormant restrictive decrees from the Council of Vienne. This era of legislative intensification created a climate of administrative hostility, where Jewish communal leaders were frequently summoned to answer for perceived theological transgressions rather than fiscal obligations. The Duke's personal piety, often described by chroniclers as a rigorous and unyielding adherence to traditionalist Catholicism, provided the moral justification for this transition. The state began to treat the Jewish population not as protected subjects of the chamber, but as a demographic whose presence was temporary and conditional upon a state of total submission. This political and theological realignment provided the structural foundation for the military and fiscal crises that would be exploited in the following decade to justify the final decree of expulsion. The outbreak of the Hussite Wars in 1419 introduced an unprecedented fiscal challenge to the Austrian treasury, as the northern frontier became a permanent theater of defensive mobilization following the First Defenestration of Prague. For Duke Albert V, the conflict was not merely a matter of ideological defense, but a crushing logistical burden that required the continuous provisioning of border garrisons along the Danube and the Thaya rivers. The military mobilization necessitated the recruitment of specialized mercenary units, including heavily armed infantry and wagon fortification specialists, whose wage requirements far exceeded the traditional feudal levies of the Austrian nobility. As King Sigismund's primary ally and son-in-law, Albert was obligated to contribute significant contingents to the consecutive crusades launched against the Bohemian reformers, an undertaking that systematically depleted the ducal silver reserves. By 1420, the cost of maintaining the landwehr and fortifying northern transit hubs like Retz and Freistadt had reached a threshold that the standard agricultural tithes could no longer sustain. This period of fiscal exhaustion forced a fundamental recalibration of the state's relationship with the Jewish financial sector. While previous administrations utilized Jewish credit to fund architectural or territorial expansion, the demands of the Hussite Wars shifted the nature of these transactions toward involuntary extractions. The ducal administration began to impose extraordinary war taxes on the Jewish communities of Vienna and Enns, often demanding immediate liquidity that exceeded the actual circulating capital of the lenders. When the community could no longer meet these escalating quotas, the Crown began to view the Jewish population not as a resource to be protected, but as an obstacle to total fiscal mobilization. A critical turning point occurred with the emergence of the Jewish Hussite conspiracy narrative, a state-sanctioned fabrication which alleged that Jewish merchants were clandestinely supplying the Bohemian rebels with sulfur, saltpeter, and iron for the manufacture of gunpowder and weaponry. This accusation served a dual administrative purpose. It provided a legal pretext for the cancellation of ducal debts and justified the seizure of private assets under the guise of national security. The economic strain was exacerbated by the disruption of the northern trade routes, which had previously linked Austrian markets to the Baltic and the Bohemian hinterlands. The cessation of safe transit through the Bohemian forest meant that the Jewish merchant networks, which Albert V had once relied upon for customs revenue, were effectively paralyzed. As the ducal debt to the Jewish quarter reached unsustainable levels, the municipal councils of Vienna and Wiener Neustadt began to advocate for the cleansing of the financial records, arguing that the war against heresy required the absolute liquidation of all internal influences. This atmosphere of economic desperation coincided with the debasement of the local currency, as the Duke was forced to lower the silver content of the Viennese Pfennig to fund his artillery train. By the autumn of 1420, the fiscal symbiosis of the previous century was replaced by a zero-sum relationship where the survival of the ducal treasury was predicated on the total dispossession of the Jewish community. This financial breakdown created the immediate logistical necessity for the mass arrests, as the state sought to convert assets into liquid capital through ransom and total forfeiture. The institutionalization of anti-Jewish sentiment in the early 15th century was driven by the intellectual framework established at the University of Vienna, which had become a preeminent center for late medieval scholasticism. The Faculty of Theology, particularly under the guidance of Peter von Polke and Thomas Ebbendorfer, shifted from traditional scriptural commentary toward a more aggressive, state-oriented polemic. This academic shift was rooted in the Via Moderna, a philosophical movement that emphasized the necessity of a unified Christian corpus politicum to ensure the stability of the realm. The university served as the primary advisor to the ducal court, providing the theological justification for the systematic erosion of Jewish legal rights. Academic disputations within the university halls began to focus on the concept of perpetual servitude, arguing that the legal protections granted by previous dukes were inherently contradictory to the spiritual mandate of a Christian sovereign. These lectures were not confined to the ivory tower, but were disseminated to the urban middle class through public sermons and the distribution of Latin and vernacular tracts. The burghers and guildmasters of Vienna, who formed the rising middle class, found in these university teachings a moral sanction for their existing economic grievances. The theological faculty argued that the Jewish presence was a primary cause of the moral and economic decay of the city, linking the practice of moneylending not just to social usury, but to a deliberate subversion of the Christian faith. This period saw the rise of the host desecration narrative as a structured academic thesis rather than merely a popular rumor. Professors at the university conducted pseudo-scientific inquiries into the nature of the Eucharist, providing the theoretical groundwork that would later be used to interpret the events in Enns as a documented physical reality. This intellectual climate empowered the municipal guilds to lobby for the exclusion of Jewish competitors from the textile and metal trades, citing the university's stance that economic interaction with non-believers endangered the spiritual integrity of the Christian artisan. Furthermore, the university's influence extended to the reform of the legal codes, where faculty members acted as consultants for the Reformatio Sigismundi, a document that envisioned a radical restructuring of the Holy Roman Empire. Within this framework, the Vienna theologians advocated for the total segregation of the Jewish population, arguing that physical proximity was the conduit for theological contagion. This academic pressure resulted in the 1417 decree that strictly enforced the wearing of the pileum cornutum, or horned hat, a measure intended to visually codify the scholarly distinctions made in the university lecture hall. The transition from intellectual debate to street-level resentment was facilitated by the university's role in training the local clergy, who translated complex Latin polemics into inflammatory Sunday homilies. By 1419, the University of Vienna had successfully transformed the presence of the Jewish community into an existential theological crisis for the state. This intellectual mobilization ensured that when the political and financial pressures of the Hussite Wars reached their peak, the urban population was already ideologically prepared to support the total liquidation of the Jewish quarter as a necessary act of religious purification. The regional crisis of 1420 originated in the Upper Austrian town of Enns, where a specific criminal accusation provided the administrative mechanism for the total suspension of Jewish legal protections across the duchy. This incident, historically termed the Enns host desecration or the Enns Gezerah, was predicated on the testimony of a Christian sexton's wife, who alleged that she had sold consecrated sacramental wafers to a Jewish resident named Israel and his wife. The charge of Hostienfrevel, or host desecration, functioned as a potent legal tool because it categorized the Jewish community not as fiscal subjects of the crown, but as active desecrators of the central mystery of the Catholic faith. According to the inquisitorial records, later compiled by the University of Vienna, the accusation asserted that these wafers were subjected to ritualized violence, including stabbing and burning, in an attempt to reenact the Passion of Christ. This specific narrative framework utilized the theological polemics developed in the university's faculty to present a local criminal case as evidence of a systemic metaphysical threat to the Christian order. The anatomy of the charge was meticulously structured to involve the wealthiest members of the community, specifically David of Enns, a prominent financier whose extensive ledger of debts included significant sums owed by local nobility and the ducal court itself. By implicating the community's financial elite in a capital religious crime, the state successfully bridged the gap between theological offense and the logistical necessity of debt cancellation. Upon receiving the report from the Enns municipal authorities, Duke Albert V bypassed the standard Babenberg judicial protections and ordered a comprehensive investigation that functioned as a show trial. The judicial process relied heavily on the use of peinliche Befragung, or judicial torture, to extract confessions that aligned with the preconceived narratives of the Viennese theologians. These coerced testimonies were then utilized to issue a general warrant that applied to every Jewish resident within the Austrian territories, regardless of their personal involvement in the Enns transaction. On the 23rd of May 1420, Albert V executed a synchronized operation that resulted in the simultaneous arrest of nearly the entire Jewish population of Austria. This operation was coordinated with military precision, targeting communities in Vienna, Krems, Herzogenburg, and several smaller Danubian settlements. The primary objective of the initial arrests was to secure the physical persons of the community leaders and to prevent the flight of capital or the destruction of financial documentation. Historical registers indicate that the prisoners were divided by gender and social status, with the wealthiest men being held in the most secure ducal fortresses to maximize the potential for ransom. The state officially suspended the 1244 Statuta Judiorum, asserting that the alleged crime in Enns had forfeited the community's right to imperial and ducal protection. The immediate result of the blood libel and host desecration charges was the total paralysis of Jewish communal life. The state-sanctioned propaganda surrounding the Enns incident was disseminated through broadsheets and town criers, effectively neutralizing any potential opposition from the moderate elements of the nobility. By framing the arrests as a defense of the Eucharist, the ducal administration provided a moral veneer for the systematic confiscation of property and the forced closure of synagogues. This legal maneuver allowed the Duke to assert direct control over the community's assets, without the need for traditional legislative approval from the estates. The Enns incident thus served as the crucial pivot point, transforming a localized accusation into a statewide mandate for total liquidation, providing the judicial momentum for the mass imprisonments that would define the following winter months. The logistical execution of the mass arrests on the 23rd of May 1420 was characterized by a level of administrative synchronization and secrecy that demonstrated the complete centralization of the ducal state under Albert V. This operation, historically documented as occurring during the Pentecost weekend, was facilitated by the distribution of sealed mandates sent to the provincial governors, or Landeshauptmänner, and the local bailiffs across the Austrian duchy. These instructions were delivered several days in advance, with strict orders to remain unopened until the designated morning, a measure intended to prevent the early flight of the Jewish population into the neighboring territories of Hungary or the bishopric of Passau. The operation encompassed every major settlement where a Jewish presence was legally recognized, extending from the urban centers of the Danube Valley, such as Vienna, Krems, and Klosterneuburg, to the southern mountainous reaches of Steyr and the Styrian borderlands. By utilizing the existing infrastructure of the municipal watch and the ducal military garrisons, the state was able to surround the Jewish quarters simultaneously, ensuring that no individual or asset could be moved before the official seizure began. In Vienna, the logistics of the arrest were managed by the municipal council in direct coordination with the ducal Hofkammer. At the appointed hour, the entries to the Judenstadt were barricaded, and armed units of the Stadtguard conducted a house-to-house sweep of the quarter. The primary objective of these units was the immediate apprehension of all male heads of households, followed by a secondary phase involving the systematic inventory of movable property. State officials, accompanied by notaries, entered the residences to seal chests containing precious metals, jewelry, and imported textiles. A critical component of this process was the sequestration of the Schuldbücher, the ledger books documenting all outstanding debts and credit transactions. These ledgers were considered the most valuable assets of the community, as their possession granted the Duke the authority to manipulate or liquidate the liabilities of the Christian nobility and urban guilds. The administrative efficiency of this seizure allowed the Crown to gain an instantaneous and comprehensive overview of the community's total wealth, effectively transitioning the Jewish quarter into a state-controlled asset. The processing of the prisoners followed a strict demographic categorization designed to facilitate the extraction of capital. The wealthiest members of the community were isolated from the general population and transported to high-security facilities, such as the towers of the Ducal Palace in Vienna or the fortified cellars of regional castles. This separation was a calculated logistical move to prioritize the negotiation of individual ransoms, which were seen as the most rapid means of liquidating the community's immediate liquid reserves. The remaining population, including women, children, and the elderly, were concentrated in communal spaces such as city halls or large stone buildings within the now vacant Jewish quarters. Historical tax registers from the summer of 1420 reflect a total cessation of normal trade and residential activity, as the state took over the physical maintenance of the Judenviertel, transforming homes into provisional prisons. Furthermore, the scope of the operation included the rural districts and the protection Jews residing on the estates of the lesser nobility. To ensure total coverage, Albert V issued a general proclamation that revoked the jurisdictional rights of any noble or ecclesiastical lord who attempted to harbor Jewish subjects. This legal maneuver integrated the diverse feudal holdings of Austria into a single, unified zone of persecution, ensuring that the arrests were not localized events but a statewide demographic purge. The logistics were further refined by the use of inventory commissions, which were dispatched to smaller towns like Enns and Tulln to verify that local bailiffs had not diverted confiscated assets for their own gain. By the conclusion of May 1420, the administrative map of Austria had been effectively cleared of its Jewish subjects, and the state had successfully transferred the entirety of the community's physical and financial existence into the custody of the ducal treasury, setting the stage for the protracted ransom negotiations of the subsequent winter. The administrative liquidation that followed the mass arrests centered on the comprehensive sequestration of the Schuldbücher, the meticulously maintained debt ledgers that served as the primary repository of Austrian financial data. This operation was managed by a specialized commission of the Ducal Hofkammer, which established a centralized bureau in Vienna to inventory the thousands of parchment and paper records seized from Jewish households across the Danube provinces. The primary objective was the systematic extraction of all outstanding credit claims to transition private wealth into a state-owned resource. Because many of these ledgers were written in Hebrew, or a specialized Judeo-German cursive, the Duke recruited scholars from the University of Vienna's theological faculty and converted apostates to serve as official translators. These individuals were tasked with cross-referencing names, principal sums, and interest rates against the testimony of Christian debtors, creating a definitive master register of the community's total outstanding capital. The legal handling of these debts followed a differentiated fiscal strategy designed to consolidate Albert V's political alliances with the regional estates. Claims held against high-ranking nobility and influential ecclesiastical institutions were frequently nullified or significantly reduced, a maneuver that secured the complicity of the ruling classes in the ongoing expulsion. Conversely, debts owed by the burgeoning urban middle class and the artisan guilds were transferred to the ducal treasury, which employed bailiffs to collect the full value of the loans, often with the addition of a state surcharge. This process effectively erased centuries of private financial relationships, replacing them with a singular predatory obligation to the sovereign. Historical accounts of the audit process indicate that even microloans provided for basic household goods were recorded and liquidated, ensuring that no fragment of the community's economic influence remained outside of state control. Parallel to the processing of the ledgers was the physical inventory of immovable assets, particularly the real estate, within the Judenstadt. Ducal notaries were dispatched to every seized property to evaluate the structural value and contents of the homes, which were often found with domestic items still in place. These inventories recorded high-value items such as silverware, spice containers, and ritual objects, which were subsequently melted down into bullion for the mint. The state also asserted ownership over the physical infrastructure of the Jewish quarter, including the communal slaughterhouses, bakeries, and the Hekdesh, or hospital. These buildings were either sold to Christian merchants at a fraction of their value or repurposed for municipal administrative functions. The revenue generated from these sales was funneled directly into the war chest for the ongoing Bohemian campaigns, fulfilling the fiscal requirements of military mobilization that had initially prompted the state's turn toward persecution. The thoroughness of this confiscation marked the end of the traditional Austrian credit cycle, which had been predicated on the legal protections of the Babenberg era. By the late summer of 1420, the administrative purge reached the rural districts, where the protection tax records of the lesser nobility were also seized and integrated into the ducal accounts. The eradication of these financial records did more than enrich the crown. It destroyed the institutional memory of the Jewish community's contributions to the Austrian economy. With the ledger books now held in the vaults of the ducal palace, the Jewish residents were stripped of their primary leverage against the state, reducing their status from active participants in the urban market to defenseless captives awaiting a theological verdict. This total dispossession ensured that even if a community member managed to survive the coming winter, they would be re-entering a world where their legal and financial existence had been completely erased from the municipal archives. The ideological pressure exerted upon the imprisoned Jewish population intensified during the autumn of 1420 As the ducal administration transitioned from the liquidation of assets to a state-mandated program of religious conversion, this phase was characterized by a systematic collaboration between the House of Habsburg and the mendicant orders, specifically the Dominicans and Franciscans, who were granted unlimited access to the detention facilities. The theological objective was to secure the mass baptism of the community, which would have legally validated the Duke's seizure of property by integrating the survivors as new Christians into the social hierarchy of the duchy. To achieve this, a series of coercive sermons was implemented, where prisoners were forced to listen to academic disputations intended to invalidate rabbinic law. Those who accepted baptism were promised immediate release, the restoration of a portion of their domestic goods, and the cancellation of their individual criminal charges related to the ens host desecration. Administrative records and contemporary Hebrew chronicles, such as the Wiener Gesera, document a profound and widespread resistance to these proselytization efforts, rooted in the concept of Kiddush Hashem, or the sanctification of the name. Rather than accepting the ducal offer of clemency through apostasy, the majority of the community maintained a state of pertinacia, a legal term used by the University of Vienna to describe their obstinate refusal to renounce their ancestral faith. This resistance was not merely passive. It involved a coordinated theological stance that rejected the legitimacy of forced baptism under the duress of imprisonment. In several instances, the prisoners utilized their remaining time in the stone cellars of the Viennese fortresses to engage in communal prayer and the study of the very texts the state had sought to erase. Historical accounts specify that the women of the community were frequently the most resolute in their defiance, often serving as the primary organizers of the refusal, even when separated from the male leadership. The state responded to this ideological stalemate by escalating the severity of the coercive measures, particularly through the targeting of minors. In late 1420, Albert V sanctioned an administrative decree that authorized the separation of children under the age of 15 from their parents. These children were forcibly removed from the detention centers and transported to monasteries and convents across Lower Austria to be raised as Christians, a policy intended to break the generational continuity of the Jewish population. Despite the psychological trauma of these separations, the adult prisoners remained largely unyielding. The refusal to convert became a structured political act that denied the Duke the moral victory he sought to present to the Holy Roman Emperor. By maintaining their religious identity, the prisoners effectively forced the state into a judicial corner, leaving execution or permanent exile as the only remaining administrative options for the sovereign. This period of resistance was sustained by a shared historical memory of previous persecutions, which provided the community with a framework for martyrdom as a valid response to systemic injustice. The theological conviction of the prisoners created a logistical crisis for the ducal bailiffs, who found that the promise of physical survival was insufficient to secure the desired mass baptisms. As the year turned toward the winter of 1421, the stalemate reached its peak. The ducal treasury had successfully absorbed the community's wealth, but the state remained burdened by the physical presence of thousands of obstinate subjects. This ideological failure of the conversion program provided the final justification for the university theologians to advocate for a more permanent solution. The transition from attempted conversion to the final decree of expulsion was thus predicated on the community's collective refusal to be integrated into the Habsburg religious order, setting the stage for the final dismantling of Jewish life in Austria. The administrative stasis of the winter of 1420 to 1421 was marked by the transformation of Vienna's urban infrastructure into a network of high-density detention facilities. While the initial arrests had been a rapid military operation, the following months were defined by a protracted bureaucratic waiting period as Duke Albert V sought formal imperial sanction from his father-in-law, King Sigismund. This legal delay necessitated the long-term maintenance of thousands of captives within subterranean chambers and repurposed stone structures throughout the city. Primary detention sites included the Fronhaus, the municipal prison, and the vaults beneath the Herzogshof, where the physical environment was characterized by extreme thermal deprivation and the total absence of sanitation. Historical climate data for the early 15th century indicates that this specific winter was among the most severe of the Little Ice Age transition, causing the temperatures in the unheated stone cellars to remain consistently below freezing. The physical toll on the prisoner population was exacerbated by the systematic reduction of food rations to a subsistence level, as the ducal treasury directed all available resources toward the provisioning of the anti-Hussite garrisons on the Bohemian border. The mortality rates within these facilities rose sharply as the winter progressed, with respiratory infections and typhus spreading rapidly through the overcrowded conditions. Administrative logs from the Viennese City Guard recorded the daily removal of deceased prisoners, whose remains were disposed of in unmarked pits beyond the city walls, further eroding the traditional burial rites that had sustained the community for centuries. The psychological attrition of the winter was compounded by the complete isolation of the captives. The state enforced a total ban on communication between the various detention sites, preventing families from confirming the survival of relatives held in separate fortresses. This isolation was a deliberate administrative tactic intended to weaken collective resolve before the final judicial proceedings. In the Jewish quarter itself, the now vacant homes were utilized by the military to house mercenaries and store munitions, effectively erasing the private domestic sphere and converting the district into a logistical hub for the crown. Albert Fie's hesitation during these months was not born of humanitarian concern, but of a precise legal requirement to ensure the forthcoming expulsion would not be challenged by other imperial estates. The Duke required a formal declaration from the king that the Jewish property was fiscally derelict due to the alleged host desecration in Enns. This period of legal maneuvering allowed the University of Vienna to finalize the Instructiones, a set of procedural guidelines that would govern the upcoming mass executions. The university masters argued that the continued survival of the obstinate prisoners throughout the winter was a testament to their inherent danger to the Christian order, providing the intellectual momentum for the final transition from imprisonment to elimination. By the spring of 1421, the remaining population was physically emaciated and socially fragmented, their institutional structures entirely replaced by the surveillance of the ducal bailiffs. The state had successfully transitioned from a policy of attempted conversion to one of absolute removal, and the end of the winter frost signaled the commencement of the final judicial phase of the Austrian Jahrzehre. The decree of expulsion, signed by Duke Albert V in the early months of 1421, served as the definitive legislative instrument for the permanent removal of the Jewish population from the Austrian duchy. This document was the formal culmination of the judicial proceedings initiated by the Enns host desecration trial, transitioning the state's posture from temporary detention to total exclusion. The legal phrasing of the edict utilized the Latin formula Judaeos in perpetuum exterminandos, which interpreted the presence of non-baptized Jews as a theological and civil contaminant that necessitated absolute eradication from the realm. Unlike previous regional expulsions in the Holy Roman Empire, which were often temporary or rescindable through the payment of fines, the 1421 decree explicitly utilized the language of eternal duration, or auf ewige Zeiten. It declared that any Jewish individual found within the borders of Austria after the implementation of the edict would be subject to immediate capital punishment without further trial, fundamentally altering the Austrian legal tradition by formally revoking the hereditary residency rights granted by the House of Babenberg. The edict was meticulously drafted in the ducal chancellery, with significant input from the University of Vienna's legal and theological faculties. It categorized the Jewish community's refusal to convert during the preceding winter months as evidence of a premeditated rebellion against the Christian state, defining their status as per duellio, a severe form of high treason. This categorization was crucial for the Crown's fiscal objectives, as it allowed for the total escheatment of all Jewish-owned land and assets to the sovereign under the legal doctrine of fiscus derelictus. The decree specifically addressed the status of outstanding credit, declaring all debts owed to the expelled community as transferred directly to the ducal treasury. This measure provided the legal basis for the Crown to collect revenues from the Christian estates while simultaneously nullifying the legal standing of the original creditors. The document also mandated the total destruction of Jewish communal infrastructure, ordering the conversion of synagogue properties into Christian chapels or municipal buildings to symbolize the triumph of Catholic orthodoxy. Publication of the decree was achieved through the distribution of copies to the Landeshauptmänner of the various provinces, ensuring that the expulsion was enforced with administrative uniformity across the entire realm. The text of the edict was read aloud in marketplaces and from church pulpits, effectively involving the Christian populace as a surveillance mechanism for the state. A critical provision of the 1421 edict was the division of the remaining captives into two distinct administrative classes, the indigent and the elite. Those deemed of no significant financial or political value were sentenced to immediate deportation via the Danube, while the leaders of the community and those considered primary instigators of religious subversion were marked for public execution. This division was not a humanitarian measure, but a logistical strategy to minimize the administrative burden of the state while maximizing the symbolic impact of the judgment. The signing of the decree thus signaled the formal end of the medieval Jewish era in Austria, establishing a legal precedent of exclusionary statecraft that would redefine the demographic landscape of Central Europe for the remainder of the 15th century. The implementation of the 1421 decree began with the logistical segregation of the Jewish captives into distinct administrative categories based on their assessed fiscal viability, while the community's elite remained in the ducal fortresses as leverage for outstanding debts. Those classified in municipal records as indigentes or paupers were subjected to immediate physical removal from the Viennese urban area. The transport of these individuals was overseen by the Viennese Municipal Guard and the office of the Unterstadtschreiber, ensuring that no communal assets or personal valuables remained in the possession of the deportees. A series of high-capacity river barges, referred to in contemporary accounts as Zillen, were requisitioned from the local shipmasters' guild specifically for this operation. To ensure the finality of the expulsion and to prevent any attempts at unauthorized return upstream, the ducal bailiffs mandated the removal of all oars, rudders, and navigational equipment from these vessels, rendering them entirely dependent on the natural velocity of the Danube current. This method of expulsion utilized the increased flow of the river during the spring meltwater period, which facilitated a rapid transit toward the eastern borders of the duchy. Historical registers indicate that several hundred individuals were crowded onto each unguided barge without provisions, effectively casting them into the jurisdiction of the downstream regional lords. The primary destination for these vessels was the Hungarian frontier, specifically the city of Pressburg, known today as Bratislava, which served as the first major port under the sovereignty of King Sigismund. Sigismund's administrative response was characterized by a pragmatic acceptance of the refugees as potential taxpayers, although their sudden arrival placed a severe logistical strain on the pre-existing Hungarian Jewish communities in Buda and Sopron. The forced departure occurred under a strict military curfew, which prohibited Christian citizens from engaging in any commerce or providing assistance to the deportees as they were marched from the front house to the riverbanks near the Rosso district. The administrative oversight of the march involved a detailed headcount to ensure that the non-productive demographic was entirely accounted for before the barges were released into the stream. This phase of the expulsion effectively purged the lower economic strata of the Jewish population, ensuring that the ducal treasury was no longer burdened with the physical maintenance of thousands of captives. The removal of these residents also allowed for the immediate repurposing of the smaller, less valuable dwellings within the Jewish quarter, which were subsequently allocated to Christian artisans and court officials. The administrative records of the Viennese toll stations confirm that the last of these vessels crossed the regional boundary by late March 1421, marking the total demographic vacation of the poorer residents. By utilizing the Danube as a conduit for mass removal, Albert V avoided the logistical costs and potential security risks of a land-based deportation through the mountainous Alpine passes. This operation finalized the physical bisection of the community, leaving only the intellectual and financial leadership to face the final theological judgment in the fields of Erdberg. The final phase of the Jewish presence in medieval Vienna centered on the physical structure of the Orzarua synagogue, which served as the terminal refuge for approximately 800 individuals who had evaded the initial transport to the ducal fortresses. This edifice, one of the largest and most robust Jewish communal buildings in Central Europe, featured thick ashlar masonry and narrow, high-placed apertures that provided it with the functional characteristics of a defensive bastion. As the decree of expulsion was implemented in March 1421, the Viennese Municipal Guard and specialized ducal sappers initiated a systematic investment of the Judenplatz, cutting off all access to the city's water supply and food reserves. The siege was characterized by a 3-day period of administrative and military stasis, during which the ducal commissioners maintained a continuous perimeter to prevent any escape into the surrounding Christian quarters. Unlike the prisoners held in the fortresses, those within the synagogue were a self-selected group that included the most ideologically resolute members of the community, determined to maintain their religious integrity outside the reach of the state's conversion program. The tactical progression of the siege involved the use of incendiary materials by the municipal forces, who attempted to smoke out the occupants by targeting the wooden roofing and the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary. Inside the building, the trapped population utilized the high medieval liturgical space as a final judicial arena, making the collective decision to enact Kiddush Hashem to avoid the certainty of forced baptism or public execution. Modern archaeological excavations conducted in 1995 beneath the pavement of the Judenplatz have provided significant empirical data regarding the final hours of the siege. These excavations revealed a substantial layer of carbonized debris, including charred prayer books and ritual objects, consistent with a high-intensity fire set from within the building. The presence of these artifacts suggests a deliberate and systematic destruction of sacred property, intended to prevent its desecration by the advancing ducal troops. Furthermore, the analysis of the foundation walls indicated that the heat of the fire was sufficient to crack the limestone blocks, reflecting the scale of the self-immolation. The culmination of the 3-day siege left the ducal administration with a logistical vacuum, as the intended public executions were rendered impossible by the mass death of the targets. This act of spiritual defiance effectively bypassed the state's judicial theater, denying Albert V the opportunity to display the triumph of the Church through coerced recantations. The municipal guard, upon breaching the smoldering ruins of the synagogue on the 4th day, found a demographic void where the center of Austrian Jewish life had once stood. The physical remains of the building were immediately seized by the Crown, and the site was subjected to a thorough administrative purge to remove any remaining Hebrew inscriptions or symbolic markers. The destruction of the Orzarua during the siege represented the definitive end of the Jewish quarter as a living entity, transitioning the Judenplatz from a center of rabbinic scholarship into a site of state-directed demolition. This event forced the remaining ducal officials to pivot their strategy toward the final group of captives held in the Erdberg district, marking the transition from the urban siege to the formal conclusion of the Austrian Jazira. The execution of the Jewish prisoners on the 12th of March 1421 occurred in the Erdberg district, a location situated to the east of Vienna's medieval fortifications on a site known as the Gänseweide, or Goose Pasture. This event served as the definitive judicial and physical conclusion to the Austrian Jazira, targeting the remaining segment of the community that had survived the winter of imprisonment and resisted the state-mandated conversion programs. Historical chronicles and administrative records from the Viennese municipal archives indicate that the victims numbered approximately 210 individuals, specifically comprised of 92 men and 118 women. These prisoners represented the intellectual and financial leadership of the community, including the survivors of the Enns investigation and the prominent residents of the Danubian towns who had been held in the ducal fortresses under high security protocols. The transport of the condemned from the city prisons to the Gänseweide was managed by the municipal guard, following a route that intentionally avoided the now vacant Jewish quarter to prevent any potential disruptions to the ongoing redistribution of property. The method of execution was the poena ignis, or death by fire, a sentence dictated by the University of Vienna's theological faculty to address the specific charge of host desecration, which was classified as a crime against the divine majesty. Unlike the spontaneous violence of the 1,349 plague years, the Erdberg execution was a highly structured state ritual, coordinated by the ducal Hofkammer, to demonstrate the absolute authority of the sovereign over the religious identity of his subjects. A massive wooden pyre was constructed using timber requisitioned from the municipal stores, designed to accommodate the simultaneous execution of the entire group. Duke Albert V, accompanied by his court and the senior masters of the university, personally presided over the proceedings, framing the act as a necessary purification of the duchy. This public display was intended to finalize the legal transition of Jewish assets to the crown, as the death of the creditors officially extinguished any remaining private claims that had not already been absorbed through the confiscation of the ledgers. The demographic consequence of the Erdberg execution was the total and immediate erasure of the Jewish presence in the Albertine territories. By eliminating the last of the community's leadership, the state ensured that no institutional memory or legal expertise remained to challenge the permanent nature of the 1421 edict. Contemporary observers, including the chronicler Thomas Ebendorfer, noted that the execution resulted in the cleansing of the realm, a term that would characterize Austrian domestic policy for the remainder of the 15th century. Following the conclusion of the fire, the municipal bailiffs were instructed to scatter the ashes into the Danube to prevent the site from becoming a place of pilgrimage or memory. This administrative effort to remove all physical traces of the victims was coupled with a decree that prohibited the mention of the Jewish names in municipal records, effectively replacing their presence with a ledger of abandoned assets. The events of March 12 marked the transition of Vienna into a city that was, in the legal language of the era, void of Jews. The immediate aftermath saw the formal dissolution of the Jewish judge's office and the reassignment of all communal functions to Christian guilds. The Erdberg execution thus functioned as the terminal point of a centuries-long history, converting a living population into an archaeological and archival category. The state had successfully utilized a localized criminal accusation to achieve a comprehensive demographic and financial realignment, setting a precedent for the total liquidation of minority communities that would be referenced by subsequent European administrations. As the smoke from the Gänseweide cleared, the medieval Austrian state entered a new phase of religious and political homogeneity built upon the total forfeiture of the community that had once served as its primary economic engine. The physical liquidation of the Jewish quarter in Vienna, following the events of March 1421, was a process managed by the municipal guilds under the direct supervision of the city council. With the residential population entirely removed through deportation or execution, the 70-plus stone houses and various communal structures became the focus of a state-sanctioned looting process. This was not a spontaneous riot, but a regulated distribution of vacant property, where the guilds of butchers, tailors, and smiths were granted the right to enter and dismantle the interiors of the quarter. According to the Viennese Bürgerspital records, the first phase involved the systematic removal of building components that held immediate resale value, including lead roofing, copper gutters, and heavy oak door frames. The guilds viewed this dismantling as a legitimate form of reparations for the perceived economic damages of the previous decades, effectively turning the act of looting into a municipal administrative procedure. Inside the domestic spaces, the removal of movable property followed a hierarchical structure. High-value household items such as brass basins, iron hearth equipment, and weaving looms were catalogued by the municipal bailiffs before being auctioned to Christian residents or allocated to the guild halls. The inventarium of the ducal chamber lists the seizure of thousands of items of clothing and domestic linens, which were frequently repurposed by the city's tailoring guild for secondary use. The workshops of Jewish artisans, particularly those involved in metalworking and jewelry, were stripped of their specialized tools, which were then integrated into the tool sets of Christian apprentices. This physical dismantling extended to the architectural details of the houses. Hebrew inscriptions on lintels were chiseled away, and ritual niche carvings were filled with mortar to prepare the buildings for their new Christian inhabitants. The redistribution of real estate was finalized through a series of Kaufbriefe or sales letters, which documented the transfer of Jewish-owned parcels to municipal officials and loyal supporters of Albert V. The environmental shift in the quarter was characterized by the total eradication of the specific infrastructure that had supported Jewish ritual life. The communal ovens used for unleavened bread were repurposed for general municipal use, and the ritual bath facilities were filled with rubble to prevent any potential spiritual pollution. By the summer of 1421, the Jewish quarter was renamed or integrated into the existing parish structures, erasing its distinct identity from the city's topological map. This period of looting also targeted the remaining smaller synagogues and schools in the provincial towns of Steyr and Krems, where local lords followed the Viennese model of systematic asset stripping. The revenue generated from the sale of these looted materials was funneled into the municipal treasury to pay off the debts incurred during the defense of the city against the Hussites. The dismantling of the Jewish quarter was thus a multi-layered economic operation that synchronized the interests of the sovereign, the university, and the urban middle class, ensuring that the physical traces of the community were obliterated alongside its people. By the conclusion of 1421, the physical landscape of the Judenstadt had been transformed into a series of Christian storefronts and residences. The transition was so complete that the municipal records of the following year began to refer to the district solely by its new Christian owners, omitting any mention of the previous occupants. This systematic erasure of material culture provided the finality required by the eternal nature of the expulsion decree, turning a formerly vibrant scholastic and commercial district into a silent extension of the medieval city. The stones of the homes remained, but their internal history had been entirely evacuated, leaving behind a shell that reflected only the needs and identities of the victors. The formal demolition of the Or Zarua synagogue in the summer of 1421 represented a calculated engineering effort to dismantle the physical and symbolic heart of the Jewish community. Under the direct orders of Duke Albert V, the structure was not merely burned but systematically razed to its foundations, using specialized tools of the municipal building trade. Stonemasons and laborers utilized heavy sledges and iron wedges to split the massive ashlar blocks that had formed the sanctuary's walls, which had been renowned for their exceptional quality and precision of fit. The demolition served a dual administrative purpose. It cleared the site for the expansion of the surrounding municipal area and provided a significant stockpile of high-grade building materials for the Duke's most prestigious intellectual project. Following the removal of the debris, the municipal carts transported the salvaged limestone and mortar to the nearby district of the University of Vienna, which was then undergoing a period of rapid physical development. The repurposed stones were integrated into the construction of the Collegium Ducale, the primary building of the university's theological and arts faculty. This architectural reuse was a deliberate manifestation of the new order, symbolizing the triumph of Christian scholasticism over rabbinic scholarship. By utilizing the physical remains of the synagogue to expand the university, the ducal administration created a permanent structural reminder of the community's elimination. The master builders utilized the largest of the synagogue stones for the foundations and lower exterior walls of the university complex, ensuring that the physical ruins of the Or Zarua now supported the very institution that had provided the theological justification for the expulsion. This process of spoliation was common in medieval urban development, but in 1421 Vienna, it reached a unique level of state-directed ideological symmetry, where the centers of Jewish learning were literally consumed to fortify the centers of Catholic education. A defining feature of this new construction was the installation of a commemorative Latin inscription on the university's facade, which explicitly linked the expansion of the college to the cleansing of the Jewish population. The text described the expulsion as a pious act of the sovereign and celebrated the destruction of the synagogue as a victory for the faith. This inscription served as a public ledger of the state's achievement, ensuring that the students and faculty who entered the halls of learning were constantly reminded of the cost of their new infrastructure. The administrative records of the university from late 1421 reflect the acquisition of these materials as donations from the ducal chamber, effectively legitimizing the looting through the veneer of academic advancement. The redistribution of the synagogue stones thus functioned as a physical erasure of Jewish history, replacing a sacred site with a secular bastion of the Habsburg state. The archaeological transition was so thorough that the original topography of the Judenplatz was irrevocably altered. The deep pits where the synagogue's foundations once rested were filled with rubble and leveled to create a new open square, which the city council designated for public use and military drills. The remaining smaller communal buildings, such as the schoolhouse and the administrative office of the Kahal, were similarly dismantled, with their timber and stone diverted to the repair of the city's fortifications along the Danube. By the time the university's new wings were completed, the physical remnants of the synagogue had been hidden within the walls of the Christian quarter, their origins masked by new mortar and architectural styles. This conversion of material culture ensured that the expulsion was not just a historical event, but a permanent feature of the city's built environment, grounding the university's authority in the tangible debris of the community it helped to displace. The administrative consolidation of the 1,421 Jezera extended beyond physical displacement and asset liquidation into a systematic purification of the state's documentary heritage. Following the Erdberg executions, the ducal chancellery initiated a comprehensive audit of the Wiener Stadtbuch and the regional Grundbücher, or land registers, with the explicit objective of removing any surviving evidence of Jewish legal agency. This process represented an early modern application of damnatio memoria, where the state sought to retroactively invalidate the community's participation in the civic life of the duchy. Specialized scribes within the municipal archives were tasked with the manual redaction of Jewish signatures from thousands of bilingual contracts and property deeds. In many instances, entire parchment folios were excised from the official record books and replaced with rewritten pages that attributed the ownership of land and the provision of capital to the fiscus or directly to the ducal treasury. This archival purge ensured that the legal history of the Austrian state would no longer reflect the complex web of credit and commerce that had defined the preceding 3 centuries. The University of Vienna's Faculty of Theology played a critical role in the intellectual restructuring that accompanied this administrative effort. Thomas Ebbendorfer of Hasselbach, in his monumental Chronica Austriae, provided the narrative framework for this new history, characterizing the Jewish presence not as a foundational pillar of the duchy, but as a transient and parasitic element. By framing the expulsion as a return to an idealized, purely Christian past, Ebbendorfer's work effectively delegitimized the contributions of the medieval rabbinic scholars and merchants. The official histories produced in the decades following 1421 deliberately misattributed major infrastructure projects and trade advancements to the ingenuity of the Christian burgher classes and the municipal guilds. This rewriting of history was essential for the legal stability of the new order. If the Jewish community's contributions were forgotten, the state could more easily justify the permanent nature of the expulsion as an act of restoration, rather than a radical demographic rupture. Furthermore, the Liber Judiorum, the specific registers that had tracked Jewish taxes and judicial cases since the Babenberg era, were either destroyed or buried deep within the ducal vaults to prevent their use in any future legal challenges. The state also targeted the memory of Jewish philanthropy and urban development, removing names from the foundations of hospitals and public works. In the records of the university itself, the history of the land acquisition for the new colleges was sanitized to omit the fact that the buildings stood upon the ruins of the Or Zarua. By 1425, the municipal chancellery had completed a reformatio of the city's archives, creating a unified documentary record that presented Vienna as a city whose prosperity was derived solely from the grace of the Church and the wisdom of the Habsburg dukes. The economic consequence of this archival erasure was the total disenfranchisement of any potential heirs or survivors seeking restitution in distant lands. Without the original ledgers or authenticated signatures, the refugees in Poland and Hungary possessed no legal standing to claim the assets that had been seized. The state's control over the written record thus finalized the economic theft initiated in 1420, grounding the ducal wealth in a sanitized history that recognized only Christian subjects. This period of documentary purification ensured that for generations of future Austrians, the Jewish history of the 13th and 14th centuries would exist only as a series of hostile theological tropes rather than a documented reality of civic and economic integration. The silence of the archives became the ultimate guardian of the 1421 decree, cementing the eternal nature of the expulsion through the total removal of the names that had once animated the Danubian markets. The liquidation of the Jewish communities in 1421 resulted in the immediate dispersal and widespread destruction of the literary and liturgical heritage that had been accumulated over centuries of rabbinic scholarship. Unlike the administrative ledgers seized for fiscal exploitation, the sacred texts, specifically the Sifrei Torah, or Torah scrolls, and the massive Talmudic codices, were treated as objects of theological contention. In the immediate aftermath of the Erdberg executions, a significant portion of these parchment scrolls was subjected to ritualized desecration and public burning, a process overseen by the mendicant orders to symbolize the literal death of the Old Covenant. However, the high material value of the parchment, coupled with a burgeoning academic interest in Hebrew philology among the University of Vienna faculty, ensured that not all manuscripts were destroyed. Instead, the libraries of the Austrian Jewish quarters were partitioned, with a substantial volume of Hebraica being transferred to the Abbey of Melk, Klosterneuburg, and the university's own nascent library collection. Within these monastic and academic settings, the Hebrew manuscripts underwent a transformation from living liturgical objects to dead artifacts of study and polemic. The Faculty of Theology utilized these seized codices to bolster the Adversos Judaeos literature, seeking to find within the rabbinic commentaries the evidence required to validate Christian supersessionism. Scholars like Peter von Pulka and Thomas Ebendorfer engaged with these texts not to preserve the intellectual legacy of the Or Zarua, but to refine their own linguistic capabilities for future proselytization efforts. This era marked the birth of a specific form of Christian Hebraism in Austria, where the physical possession of the community's most sacred books served as a trophy of the 1421 Jezera. Inventories from the Abbey of Melk during the mid-15th century reveal the presence of numerous Hebrew volumes, often rebound in heavy wooden boards to align with the aesthetic standards of the monastic scriptoria, their original provenance frequently obscured by new Latin titles. A significant demographic of the seized texts met a purely utilitarian fate through the process of maculature. Because parchment was an expensive and durable commodity, many Hebrew scrolls were dismantled and used as reinforcing material for the bindings of Christian theological works and municipal account books. Fragments of 13th-century Austrian Torah scrolls and prayer books have been identified by modern bibliographers as membra disjecta within the bindings of the Vienna University archives, where the Hebrew script remained hidden for centuries inside the covers of Latin tracts. This practice of repurposing sacred parchment for secular or Christian bindings functioned as a final, physical layer of the expulsion, literally burying the words of the Jewish scholars within the structure of the new order's literature. The destruction of these texts was so thorough that only a fraction of the original Sowing Light library survived as intact volumes. The fate of these scrolls also extended to the private collections of the Austrian nobility, who viewed the beautifully illuminated Haggadah and prayer books as luxury items and curiosities. These manuscripts were often stripped of their Jewish context and valued primarily for their artistic merit, reflecting the high Gothic style that had characterized the collaboration between Jewish scribes and Christian illuminators in the preceding century. By 1430, the intellectual vacuum left by the expulsion was total. The books that had once guided the spiritual life of thousands were either locked in the silence of monastic vaults, repurposed as structural debris for new bindings, or destroyed in the fires of the Gensovide. This removal of the written word ensured that the community could not be rebuilt through its texts, cementing the eternal nature of the 1421 decree, by severing the transmission of rabbinic tradition within the Austrian duchy. The immediate economic consequence of the 1421 Jahre was a systemic paralysis of the Viennese credit market, as the elimination of the Jewish financial sector removed the primary source of liquid capital for the city's burgeoning artisan and merchant classes. While the ducal treasury had successfully confiscated the physical ledgers and bullion, this wealth was rapidly diverted toward military expenditures rather than being reinvested into the urban economy. The absence of the Jewish bill of exchange system, which had facilitated long-distance trade without the physical transport of currency, led to a localized liquidity trap. Christian merchant guilds, particularly those involved in the textile and salt trades, found themselves unable to secure the short-term loans necessary to provision large-scale shipments along the Danube. Historical tax records from 1422 and 1423 reflect a significant contraction in municipal customs revenues, as the specialized trade networks that linked Austria to the Levantine and Baltic markets through Jewish intermediaries were severed without immediate replacement. The silence in the markets was most pronounced in the sectors of luxury commodities and raw materials, where Jewish merchants had acted as the exclusive brokers for high-value imports like Oriental spices, silk, and dyes. The Christian guilds of Vienna, governed by restrictive internal regulations and lacking the transcontinental family connections of the Jewish firms, proved incapable of maintaining the volume of trade required to sustain the city's status as a premier European commercial hub. The municipal archives from this period document a sharp increase in Säumigkeit, or default, among Christian burghers who had relied on Jewish credit to bridge the gap between production and sale. Furthermore, the loss of the Jewish metallurgy and assaying expertise led to a decline in the quality of the local coinage. The Viennese mint, which had benefited from the constant influx of foreign bullion through Jewish traders, struggled to maintain its silver standards, contributing to a period of inflationary pressure known in economic history as the Schinderling era. The administrative vacuum extended to the management of municipal annuities and the financing of public infrastructure. The Hofkammer attempted to fill the gap by encouraging the rise of Christian Wucherer or usurers, yet these individuals often operated with significantly higher interest rates and less legal transparency than the regulated Jewish lenders of the 14th century. This lack of institutionalized credit meant that the reconstruction of the city's defenses and the maintenance of its bridges were frequently delayed due to the inability of the municipal council to raise ready capital. The specialized Judenmarkt area, once the most active commercial zone in the city, remained largely stagnant as the new Christian owners lacked the specialized knowledge to manage the complex wholesale operations formerly housed there. The loss of human capital was equally devastating. The expulsion had removed not only financiers, but also the scribes, translators, and legal experts who had navigated the bilingual and multi-jurisdictional complexities of Central European trade. By the mid-1422s, the demographic and economic profile of Vienna had shifted from a dynamic international trade center to a more insular, guild-dominated regional market. The silence was not merely a lack of noise in the streets, but a structural cessation of the high-velocity capital circulation that had defined the high medieval period. The state's decision to prioritize theological homogeneity over economic utility resulted in a stagnation that lasted for decades, as the city's merchant class struggled to develop the autonomous banking institutions that were already emerging in the Italian and Rhenish cities. This period of economic contraction served as a tangible reminder of the interdependence that had existed before 1421, demonstrating that the removal of a demographic pillar could not be accomplished without compromising the fiscal vitality of the state itself. The archives of the 1422s stand as a record of this unintended consequence, where the eternal expulsion was accompanied by a long-term decline in the duchy's economic competitiveness. The demographic reorganization of the Central European Jewish population following the 1421 Jahre was defined by a rapid eastward migration toward the territories of the Kingdom of Hungary and the Kingdom of Poland. Those who survived the unguided river transit arrived in the Hungarian border regions during a period of relative legal stability, under the reign of King Sigismund of Luxembourg. Unlike the exclusionary policy of the Austrian Duchy, the Hungarian administration prioritized fiscal pragmatism, viewing the sudden influx of experienced merchants and artisans as a mechanism to stimulate the urban economies of the upper Hungarian mining towns and the Danubian ports. Sigismund issued several protective decrees in the early 1422s that facilitated the integration of the Austrian refugees into existing communities in Pressburg, Sopron, and Buda. These refugees were categorized under the Hungarian legal status of Camerae Regiae Servorum, a royal protection that permitted them to re-establish credit operations and trade networks in exchange for a direct poll tax paid to the Hungarian crown. Further to the northeast, the Kingdom of Poland emerged as the primary long-term destination for the displaced Austrian families. Under the Jagiellonian King Władysław II Jagiełło, Poland maintained the General Charter of Jewish Liberties, originally issued in 1264 and reaffirmed by Casimir the Great in the 14th century. The arrival of the Austrian exiles coincided with the development of Kazimierz, the Jewish suburb of Krakow, which became a focal point for the reconstruction of Ashkenazi communal life. Administrative records from the Krakow Municipal Chancellery during the mid-1420s reflect a significant increase in the registration of Hebrew names associated with Austrian origins, particularly in the sectors of textile wholesaling and international salt trade. The Polish state provided a degree of communal autonomy through the Kahal system that far exceeded what had been possible in the later years of the Habsburg administration, allowing the refugees to establish new synagogues and cemeteries that adhered to the liturgical standards of the Vienna school. The integration process in the East was characterized by the physical transplanting of the institutional structures that had been liquidated in Austria. While their assets had been seized, the refugees carried with them the technical knowledge of the Austrian minting processes and the sophisticated bookkeeping methods of the Danubian markets. In the Polish city of Lemberg, or Lviv, the influx of Austrian Jewish expertise facilitated the expansion of trade routes toward the Black Sea, linking the Baltic markets to the Oriental networks that had been disrupted by the fall of the Viennese hub. This period of dispersal also saw the emergence of a distinctive Austrian rite within the Polish synagogues, as the survivors sought to preserve their specific regional customs and legal interpretations in their new environment. The demographic shift was so substantial that by 1430, the center of gravity for Ashkenazi intellectual and economic activity had definitively moved from the Danube Valley to the Vistula and the Hungarian plains. This eastward migration functioned as an involuntary technology transfer, where the human capital of the Austrian Duchy was absorbed by its geopolitical rivals. The Jagiellonian and Luxembourg dynasties utilized the expertise of the expelled population to modernize their own fiscal administrations and to fortify their urban middle classes against the influence of the Germanic guilds. The immediate aftermath of the dispersal was thus defined by a fundamental realignment of the European commercial landscape, where the silence in the Viennese markets was countered by the burgeoning activity in the squares of Krakow and Buda. The survivors of 1421, while stripped of their physical wealth, became the architects of a new, more resilient network of communities that would sustain the Ashkenazi identity throughout the following centuries of Eastern European history. The administrative and fiscal conclusion of the 1421 Gesera provided the House of Habsburg with an unprecedented infusion of liquid capital and real estate assets that fundamentally altered the political trajectory of the Albertine line. By late 1421, the Ducal Hofkammer had successfully integrated the confiscated wealth of the Jewish community into the state treasury, utilizing these resources to eliminate the crushing debts accumulated during the early phases of the Hussite Wars. This fiscal stabilization allowed Duke Albert V to bypass the traditional financial constraints imposed by the Austrian estates, granting him a degree of executive autonomy that his predecessors had lacked. The Duke utilized the seized bullion and the revenue from the newly Christianized property markets to finance a permanent standing military force which was essential for the defense of the Danubian frontier against the persistent threat of the Bohemian reformers. This shift from a reliance on feudal levies to a professional mercenary infrastructure solidified Albert's reputation as the primary military bulwark of the Holy Roman Empire in the East. The consolidation of power was inextricably linked to Albert's strategic relationship with his father-in-law, Emperor Sigismund of Luxembourg. The wealth extracted from the Jewish community served as a primary funding source for the imperial crusades against the Hussites, a contribution that Sigismund recognized by formally designating Albert as his heir to the crowns of Bohemia and Hungary. This dynastic alignment was further reinforced through the Duke's sponsorship of the University of Vienna's theological faculty, which provided the ideological framework for his rule. By presenting a purified Austria as a model of Catholic orthodoxy, Albert positioned himself as the leading secular defender of the faith in Central Europe. This political image was crucial for his standing with the papacy, particularly during the ecclesiastical tensions following the Council of Constance. The ducal administration's adherence to the exclusionary policies of the 1421 decree was viewed in Rome as a tangible commitment to the eradication of heresy and non-belief, securing Albert the consistent diplomatic and financial support of the Holy See. Furthermore, the redistribution of Jewish assets allowed the Duke to cultivate a loyal network of noble and municipal supporters. By granting seized lands and urban properties to influential members of the Austrian nobility, Albert successfully neutralized internal opposition and tied the fortunes of the leading families to the stability of his own reign. The municipal councils of Vienna and Wiener Neustadt, having benefited from the elimination of their Jewish competitors and the acquisition of communal buildings, became firm institutional allies of the ducal court. This domestic consolidation ensured that the Austrian heartlands remained stable even as the surrounding regions were engulfed in religious conflict. The administrative efficiency developed during the liquidation of the Jewish quarters was repurposed for the centralization of the ducal chancellery, creating a more sophisticated bureaucratic apparatus that managed the state's finances with rigorous precision. By the mid-1422s, the Duke's political ambitions were no longer confined to the provincial borders of the Austrian Duchy. The fiscal and ideological foundation laid in the wake of the 1421 Jezera provided the momentum for his eventual election as King of the Romans, King of Hungary, and King of Bohemia. The transition of the Albertine Habsburgs from regional dukes to the premier power in Central Europe was thus predicated on the total forfeiture of the Jewish community's existence. The state's move toward absolute religious homogeneity was not merely a theological project, but a calculated strategy of state building that utilized the debris of the medieval Jewish order to construct the foundations of the early modern Habsburg Empire. The consolidation of Albert V's authority in this period represented the successful conversion of human and financial tragedy into a durable political legacy that would define the House of Austria for the remainder of the 15th century. The years immediately following the 1421 expulsion were defined by a comprehensive spatial reorganization of Vienna's internal topography, as the ducal administration sought to erase the physical memory of the Jewish presence and replace it with a unified Christian aesthetic. The district, formerly known as the Judenstadt, which had functioned as an autonomous enclave within the city's central core, was subjected to a formal process of rechristening. This involved the systematic reassignment of street names and the physical reconfiguration of property boundaries to align with the liturgical and administrative requirements of the Catholic state. The central square of the former quarter was designated as a site for public religious processions, particularly the Feast of Corpus Christi, which was elevated to a primary municipal celebration to commemorate the cleansing of the city. This urban reimagining transitioned Vienna from a multi-confessional merchant hub into a civitas Christiana, where the architecture of the city itself served as a testament to the religious homogeneity enforced by the House of Habsburg. A central architectural focus of this period was the construction of the Corpus Christi Chapel, which was erected on the precise site of the demolished communal center. This structure was designed as a theological monument to the victory over the alleged host desecrators of Enns. utilizing a late Gothic architectural style that emphasized the permanence of the new religious order. The ducal chancellery issued specific building permits that favored the establishment of clerical residences and monastic dormitories within the former Jewish quarter, effectively saturating the district with ecclesiastical presence. Furthermore, the municipal authorities mandated the installation of Christian icons and Marian shrines at the intersections that had previously marked the entry points to the Jewish neighborhood, creating a visual and symbolic boundary that signaled the total eradication of the previous demographic. The expansion of the parish of St. Stephen further solidified this transition, as the cathedral's influence was extended into the newly vacated urban spaces. The transformation also encompassed the city's commercial landscape, specifically the development of the Neuer Markt, or New Market. This project redirected the flow of wholesale trade away from the traditional Jewish commercial hubs and toward new guild-controlled warehouses that operated under strict Christian statutes. The construction of the Bürgerspiegel's new wings utilized the seized land of the Jewish quarter to expand the city's social welfare facilities, further integrating the confiscated property into the municipal charitable system. These projects were funded by the special taxes levied on the newly occupied properties, ensuring that the urban landscape reflected the fiscal and theological priorities of Duke Albert V. By 1425, the university campus had also expanded significantly, with new lecture halls and dormitories creating an intellectual garrison that dominated the northern section of the city. The new layout of Vienna was designed to prevent the re-emergence of any non-Christian enclave, establishing a precedent for the closed city model. The high-density, multifunctional character of the medieval quarter was replaced by a more regulated, ecclesiastically dominated streetscape. Every new stone and spire served as a physical manifestation of the state's authority and its commitment to the 1421 decree. This era of construction finalized the transition of Vienna from a diverse regional market to a defensive bastion of the Habsburg state, where the city's very foundations were rebuilt to reflect the total forfeiture of its Jewish history. The new face of Vienna thus represented the physical culmination of the Jezera, grounding the eternal expulsion in the permanent stone and mortar of the reimagined city. The 1421 Vienna Jezera established a specific administrative and judicial template that fundamentally altered the methodology of state-sponsored expulsions across the Holy Roman Empire and the broader European continent. This Austrian model was characterized by its departure from the sporadic, riot-driven violence of the 14th century, replacing it with a synchronized, bureaucratically managed liquidation of an entire demographic. The legal innovation of Duke Albert V rested on the successful categorization of the Jewish community's presence as a state security risk and a theological affront, providing a dual justification that could be exported to other jurisdictions. Central to this precedent was the use of a high-profile documented criminal case, the Ens Host desecration, to serve as the evidentiary basis for the universal revocation of all prior hereditary protections. By documenting the crime through the University of Vienna's theological faculty, the Austrian administration created a transferable legal dossier that proved a sovereign could unilaterally annul the 1,244 Babenberg charters without violating imperial law. The theological justifications codified in Vienna provided the intellectual framework for subsequent expulsions. In the mid-15th century, most notably the 1,442 expulsion from the Duchy of Bavaria-Landshut and the 1,450 removal from the territories of Ludwig IX. In these instances, the Bavarian dukes explicitly referenced the Austrian proceedings to justify the seizure of financial ledgers and the total forfeiture of Jewish real estate. The Vienna faculty became the primary legal authority for princes seeking to centralize their fiscal administrations. The university's written opinions on the doctrine of perpetual servitude were circulated among the imperial estates as a manual for state-directed dispossession. This precedent demonstrated that the economic vacuum created by an expulsion could be mitigated through the systematic transfer of debt obligations to the state treasury, a logistical lesson that was later observed and adapted by the monarchs of the Iberian Peninsula. The 1421 model proved that religious homogeneity was a viable path to political consolidation, provided the state possessed the administrative capacity to inventory and absorb the community's capital during the transition. Furthermore, the legal precedent of 1421 introduced a rigorous standard for judicial cleansing that would reappear during the 1475 blood libel trials in Trent. The use of inquisitorial procedures to extract confessions that aligned with state-sanctioned theological narratives became a hallmark of late medieval exclusionary politics. The Austrian model also influenced the development of the jus reformandi, the right of the prince to determine the religion of his subjects, by establishing that non-Christian populations held only a conditional, rather than an inherent, right to residency. This shift from feudal protection to absolute state discretion marked the transition into early modern political theory, where the state's identity was inextricably linked to the religious uniformity of its populace. By the late 15th century, the Austrian model had evolved into a standard geopolitical strategy within the Holy Roman Empire, used by various regional lords to resolve domestic debt crises and to secure the support of the burgeoning Christian middle class. The administrative thoroughness of the 1421 decree, specifically its emphasis on the eternal nature of the ban, and the total destruction of communal records served as the benchmark for the finality of later European expulsions. The legacy of Albert V's statecraft was thus preserved in the legal archives of the continent, where the 1421 Gezerah was cited not as a localized tragedy, but as a successful exercise in sovereign authority and religious purification. This precedent ensured that the methods developed in the Danube Valley would resonate through European law for centuries, providing the structural foundations for the exclusionary practices that would define the demographic boundaries of the early modern era. The preservation of the history of the 1421 Gezerah was achieved through a decentralized network of contemporary chronicles and liturgical compositions that functioned as a counter-archive to the sanitized official records of the Habsburg state. The primary historical document from this period is the Wiener Gezerah, a detailed Hebrew account, likely composed by a survivor or a close contemporary in the mid-15th century. This text provides a specific martyrological framework that records the names of the community leaders and the precise dates of the arrests and executions, ensuring that the demographic details purged from the Viennese Stadtbücher remained accessible to the Jewish diaspora. The chronicle utilizes a structured narrative that prioritizes the legal and theological arguments used during the imprisonment, offering an internal perspective on the community's resistance that contradicts the obstinacy labels used by the University of Vienna theologians. These manuscripts were clandestinely copied and distributed among the burgeoning communities of Krakow and Prague, where they served as foundational texts for the collective memory of the Austrian exile. Liturgical preservation served as a secondary, yet equally durable, mechanism for maintaining the ghost of the Or Zarua. Special Selihat, or penitential prayers, were composed specifically to commemorate the martyrs of Erdberg and the destruction of the Vienna synagogue. These prayers were integrated into the annual cycle of the Ashkenazi liturgy, particularly during the fast of the 9th of Av and the anniversaries of the 1421 edict. The language of these poems often utilized metaphors of light extinguished, a direct reference to the Or Zarua tradition, effectively turning the intellectual title of Rabbi Isaac ben Moses into a symbol of the lost Austrian center. By reciting these laments, the refugees in Poland and Hungary ensured that the technical details of the expulsion, such as the river-bound barges and the seizure of the ledgers, were transmitted through oral and ritual repetition, bypassing the physical destruction of the community's library. The institutional memory of the Vienna community was also codified in the Memorbücher, or Books of Remembrance, which began to circulate in the late 15th century. These registers served as a formal ledger of the deceased, listing the names that the ducal administration had sought to erase from the land records. In the Memorbook of Nuremberg and other Rhenish cities, the Austrian victims were granted a permanent place in the communal roll call, a practice that established a trans-regional bond of memory. Furthermore, the Minhag Österreich, or the Austrian Rite, persisted as a distinct liturgical and legal tradition in exile. Survivors maintained the specific prayer variations and judicial interpretations developed by the 13th century Vienna sages, ensuring that the sowing light continued to influence Ashkenazi halakha even in the absence of a physical presence in the Danube Valley. Finally, the memory of 1421 was maintained through the internal communal ban, or harem, which many refugee groups placed upon the Austrian territories. This legal prohibition, which discouraged Jewish resettlement in the lands of Albert V, functioned as a psychological boundary that defined Austria as a forbidden land for generations. This ban was not merely a response to the violence, but a formal rejection of the Habsburg legal framework that had revoked the hereditary protections of the Babenberg era. The persistence of this ghost ensured that the 1421 Jezera remained a living precedent in Jewish history, serving as a warning of the volatility of state protection and a testament to the resilience of a textual identity that survived the total forfeiture of physical property. By the time the first Jewish individuals returned to Vienna centuries later, they did so within a historical context that had been meticulously preserved through these secret chronicles and silent traditions of the East. The 1421 expulsion did more than reorganize domestic finances. It triggered a fundamental recalibration of Central European diplomacy as the Austrian Duchy lost its primary trans-territorial communication network. For centuries, the Jewish community had functioned as a neutral diplomatic layer, facilitating secret negotiations and credit transfers between rival houses that were often hampered by formal feudal protocol. The total removal of this demographic created a diagnostic vacuum in the Habsburg Chancellery's external intelligence, particularly regarding the movements of the Ottoman and Jagiellonian courts. While Albert V solidified his standing within the Holy Roman Empire, his neighbors, specifically the Kingdom of Poland, capitalized on the influx of Austrian human capital to modernize their own diplomatic infrastructures. The Vienna School of Finance and Administration, now operating from the eastern hubs, provided the Polish crown with the logistical tools to challenge the Teutonic Order and the Bohemian estates, shifting the center of regional influence toward the Vistula. This geopolitical shift was formalized through the rise of the local councils in the east, which utilized the expertise of the Austrian exiles to manage complex interstate customs disputes. In the German-speaking lands, the Austrian model created a diplomatic rift with those imperial free cities and principalities that still maintained the 1244 Babenberg standards, leading to a fragmented fiscal landscape. The bishopric of Passau and the Bavarian duchies, while occasionally imitating the expulsion, found that the sudden absence of the Viennese credit market made their own trade agreements with the Venetian Republic more difficult to enforce. The loss of the Jewish letters of protection meant that Austrian merchants abroad no longer possessed the transnational legal support that had been facilitated by Jewish brokers in Italian and Flemish ports. Consequently, the Austrian duchy became increasingly insular, its foreign policy tied almost exclusively to the defense of the Catholic faith and the support of the papacy, while its neighbors expanded their reach through the dynamic commercial networks of the East. The geopolitical realignment also affected the Council of Basel, where the treatment of non-believers became a point of contention among the European estates. Jagiellonian diplomats utilized the presence of the refugees to frame their kingdom as a haven of legal predictability, contrasting their adherence to established charters with the perceived arbitrary seizures of the Habsburgs. This diplomatic positioning allowed Poland to secure more favorable trade treaties with the Hanseatic League and the Northern Maritime Powers, who valued the stability of the Krakow-based credit markets. The shift in power was not merely territorial, but intellectual, as the authoritative weight of the Austrian rabbinate transitioned to the Polish academies, making Krakow the new arbiter of Ashkenazi legal and social norms. This transfer of authority meant that the Habsburgs no longer held influence over the internal governance of the most significant demographic in the East. The immediate geopolitical result of the 1421 Jezera was thus the creation of a powerful Eastern-oriented economic and diplomatic axis that operated independently of the Danubian center, fundamentally altering the strategic map of the late Middle Ages. By the 1432, the Judenverbot, or the formal prohibition of Jewish residency, had evolved from a localized edict into a standardized clause within the Hofordnung, the central court regulations of the Habsburg state. This legal exclusion effectively removed the Jewish population from the category of subjects and placed them into a permanent state of externalization. The fiscal vacuum left by the community was addressed through the expansion of the Kammergut, the sovereign's personal estate, which now included the entirety of the former Jewish landholdings and the redirected revenues of the communal tithes. This centralization of assets allowed the ducal chancellery to operate with a level of financial independence that bypassed the traditional veto power of the Landstände, the provincial estates of the nobility. Consequently, the 1432 saw the emergence of a more assertive Landesfürstliche Gewalt, or princely authority, which utilized the confiscated wealth of 1421 to fund the permanent bureaucratic structures required for a centralized European power. The brief elevation of Albert V to the imperial throne, as King Albert II in 1438, served as the ultimate political validation of his exclusionary statecraft. His reign, though short-lived, demonstrated to the various estates of the Holy Roman Empire that the total liquidation of a minority demographic could be utilized as a mechanism for sovereign consolidation. During this era, the urban landscape of Vienna reached a state of demographic stasis. The former Judenstadt was fully subsumed into the parish tax rolls, and the great guild statutes of the 1432 institutionalized a closed economic system. This hierarchy was designed to prevent the re-emergence of independent credit markets, ensuring that all financial transactions were monitored by the state or the church. The resulting economic environment was characterized by a sustained deflationary trend, as the high-velocity capital circulation of the 14th century was replaced by the static, land-based wealth of the Christian guilds. Intellectually, the middle of the 15th century was marked by an era of enclosure. The University of Vienna, having successfully provided the theological framework for the expulsion, shifted its focus toward the internal suppression of the Hussite influence and the consolidation of the Via Moderna philosophy. The legal consciousness of the duchy was now grounded in the precedent of 1421, which established that the sovereign held the absolute right to revoke ancestral charters in the interest of religious purity. This transformation ensured that the Austrian heartlands remained a closed system, hostile to the transnational movements and the multi-confessional trade networks that had once linked the Danube to the Mediterranean. By 1440, the administrative erasure of the Jewish community was so complete that the history of the sages of Vienna existed only as a series of hostile footnotes in the new imperial chronicles. The fragmentation of the continent into rigid confessional zones was thus prefigured in the cold ash of the Austrian experience, where the state's drive for homogeneity replaced the complex medieval synthesis with the structural silence of the early modern era.